Welcome back. Our next session is with Susan Cleyle. It said Ms. Cleyle, but I can't do that. I think we're an informal enough group. Sue Cleyle is University Librarian at Memorial University in Newfoundland, Labrador. Prior to this role, Sue served as Director of the Center of Innovation in Teaching and Learning at Memorial. That was since 2012, and held library leadership roles that include the position of Associate University Librarian at the QE2 Library at Memorial University from 2003 to 2012. She was also the co-founder of the Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice Journal, and her current research interests explore the value of library associations and their impact on careers of academic library leaders throughout Canada. So please welcome Sue.
So Jen was taking me through a tour of my hometown, which is Kemptville. It's a town over. Today, and we went into a shop where thankfully Jen spent money and I didn't, and so she satisfied all my shopping needs. However, the woman at the till said, "Oh my goodness, you two are sisters." So you need to understand that for those who, I don't know if you just saw Jen, but I'm up here and Jen's down here. So I looked at the woman, she was like, "No, really, you're like sisters." We've known each other long enough that in fact, I think we are. There you go. Anyway, thank you very much for having me today. I feel a little sheepish standing here in front of you because I'm University Librarian at Memorial. I've been there for a year, but as Jen said, I was out of the library land for the years that started for Memorial University. So I want to provide that context for you because I'm really... because I'm going to hear and talk to you about some of the things that we did and talk about the initial decisions and circumstances of the things that did happen at Memorial University. There are things that I was just not simply privy to in terms of decisions. But I'm going to present the overview, but I'm happy to tell you that my team, our collections librarians, the group that looked at the cancellations and the projects are online with us today, and they assured me that they would not let me hang out to dry, and that because really I feel like I'm Vanna White in some ways, I'm just here tapping the letters and turning them around, but really the brains of the operations are off stage setting things up, and that's my team. So say hey guys. Hey guys. That's how we do things at home. Everyone says hey. So, and I feel a lot better knowing you're there. I want to thank Stéphanie for her presentation this afternoon. The detail that she gave us around what happened at UDM is in many ways parallels what we did at Memorial University. And it's clear from everything that we heard from her conversation, and hope you'll get from what I'm going to explain to you this afternoon about our experience, is that there's a lot to be gained, and to Mark's point, about sharing and learning from each other, and how we're going to move forward. So what we're doing right now is just one small piece of this puzzle in terms of academic libraries and what we need to do to provide the resources that our faculties and our students need. So lots of things to be talking about. Maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A. Okay, I think I know what I'm doing here. Let's see what happens. It worked. So because of the bleak financial forecast that Memorial University was facing around 2012, we suspected and anticipated at that time that we would eventually find ourselves in a position where things were not going to look good around our journal allocation. And so like the graph that Stéphanie showed you, and like what you're experiencing, our numbers were going straight up. We had the dollar impacting us. We also had publisher increases. And it was just clear that we couldn't sustain things. So 2012 was where everyone was starting to get freaked out. And our renewals were coming up. So the team within the libraries started to plan and prepare for what they were going to do and what would lay ahead. So as I mentioned, renewals were looming. Decisions needed to be made. And despite some of the smaller cost-saving measures that took place, what happened right then was they started to do little things. It was clear that we had to look at the big packages. So we had to make sure that in a steady state for our material budget, and that's what we were facing at the time, that we had to do something. So 2014, A cancellation subcommittee was formed, and in 2015, they started the task of cancelling CAALs, Cambridge, Oxford, Wiley, and Springer. So in my world, we always talk about cows. So a survey was created, again, looking at the same processes in many ways that Stéphanie at UDM did. We did a survey created with a list of journals included in the CAALs package, and it was shared throughout various communication vehicles campus-wide. And that included an e-newsletter, information on our website. And while for the rest of my conversation I'm going to be focusing largely on cows, I want you to know that we did a similar process with Taylor and Francis, and currently we're doing that right now with Sage. So those big initial learning gains that I want to talk to you about happened during really the first round of cancellations. And so I'm going to focus on that experience specifically. So again, just to provide a little more context and to follow up on Stéphanie's presentation, our subcommittee used the following cancellation criteria. We used information from consultations and meetings. We got direct feedback from our community, namely our faculty and our grad students, and I'm assuming our students as well. We looked at usage stats. We got input from our subject librarians. Obviously, our expertise was critical in this exercise. And we looked at cost per download and interlibrary loan, and then we looked at possible alternative access points. So, just to give you a glimpse of our initial cancellation with the final CAALs numbers and the cancellation outcome, we canceled over 4,000 journals, just over 4,000 journals, in 4 packages. 219 titles were actually purchased, and we had over almost 2,100 embargoed access with 1,700 titles canceled. So the total cost of those 4 packages together was $1.4 million, and we purchased back about $600,000. So a lot of work. To the points that were made in the Q&A, this is a lot of work to cancel, to have a savings of $800,000. Okay. So this is kind of the crux of, in my slides that I want to talk about, and you can come back and ask about specifics, but I think this is an important piece, and it dovetails really nicely with what Stéphanie was talking about. And it's around that reputation piece, that value that we bring as academic libraries and librarians to the experience, and the potential damage of doing something like this, like busting open your packages, can do for your reputation within the community. So shortly after this information was posted, and if you remember the process around doing the survey and such, and we have a website as well, and you're free to go have a look at it, some of our faculty actually went to social media. So, you know, they got their knickers in a knot, and I've been around long enough to remember the 1990s, when we did a bunch of journal cancellations. Anyone else remembers those times? And they got their knickers in a knot then too. So they went to social media, Twitter in particular, to express their concern and frustration. So a different time from the 90s, right? There's no letters to the editor. They go straight to Twitter and to social media. So this sparked media interest. And the rest of the story, as I'm sure many of you look with your sympathetic faces, I can see you all looking at me. I wasn't on the news, but my folks were. You heard that it went to the media. And so our decision to cancel that big package was received national media attention, went right across the country, with both positive and negative impacts. And because we were one of the first universities to do this cancellation, we were on the front page in many ways. And there's takeaways from that. I think institutionally, also within the libraries, we learned a lot from that experience. The major takeaway from that is that you can never be too proactive with communications, and Stéphanie made reference to that. And in fact, made the point that it's probably one of the most important things that you can do once you start to cancel this, because it's all about making sure that no one forgets how important and how valuable we are to the academic experience. And this I don't want to use the word noise, but this noise about canceling, but I am going to use this word, should not be a detractor from that, and should not negatively impact what it is we do as we start to move forward, because we're going to be positioning for the future. So the facts were initially misconstrued, you know, as anything is when you go to social media, and there really was a much needed perspective missing from those early stories. So if you look at the first CBC News article, for example, and I don't know if you can actually see it up there, MUN was to cancel thousands of journal subscriptions. That's what it said. It sounds dire, of course, but there's no context in that. And because we subscribed to over 80,000 journals, we did at the time. And there were challenges around this as a result of that news article, and just that one little soundbite in the cycle. But Memorial, because they're troopers, they're the best, in fact, they persevered with the same key messages over and over. And I think that's one of the big things, as anyone knows, you stick to your key messages. You stick to about the value. You stick to the importance of what we're getting. You stick to the minimal impact as a result of bringing your experts and your librarians to the table to do this work. And I think we were very successful with that. And so eventually the tide turned. And the nice thing about that, too, was the media started, and I think other institutions were coming on board at that time and starting to cancel as well. There were other stories starting to pop up. And so the media actually stopped and took a breath and started to look at the complexity of the issues. We were feeding the right information to them, and finally it stuck. In fact, we tried to throw it at them probably, and that's when it did stick. So the nice thing, too, was our provost came on board. And I think Stephanie may have mentioned to it, or someone in coffee had mentioned it to me, that senior administration in this whole exercise is absolutely critical. And so that communication going up is just as important as the communication going out to the side to your faculty and to your grad students and to your other students, as well as the communication into your internal community. So as university librarian, that's my job, right? My job is to make sure the provost knows what's going on, the provost understands, and the provost is on board with what we're doing, and the provost doesn't have to worry about things. And so our university librarian was on board with all of that. And in fact, a university librarian at the time, Lorraine Busby, our provost came on board and wrote in her blog that really, I think, was the tipping point for us institutionally. So if I had a piece of advice on that, is to make sure that you don't lose sight of that communication point and making sure that as you move forward that you have that support. Because otherwise, you're dead in the water. So internal communication perspective, from that perspective, that support, and this is her blog actually up here, and Noreen Golfman, Dr. Golfman is truly respected within the Newfoundland community for a whole bunch of reasons. And so when she speaks, she's like E.F. Hutton, right? Okay, no one is old enough to remember that commercial. Who remembers that commercial quick? Yes, thank you. There's a few of us. When E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone listens. That's the tagline. Okay, so when Noreen speaks, everyone listens. And having her come out, as I said, she just highlighted the expertise and the respect for the work that the librarians at Memorial were doing. And as a result of that, the shelf life ended on our news cycle, which was absolutely tremendous. So we ripped that Band-Aid off. We bled. It was nasty. It was not good. We did not look good in the media initially. We turned the tide, and the Band-Aid went back on. And so the cool thing about that was I think we helped other institutions as they started to do their cancellations, but it also helped us as we move forward. So there were some really positive things that came out of that media attention. It caused those growing pains that we had, that we were developing that expertise, and Stephanie talked about that. One of the major benefits of going through this exercise is that we now have this expertise within our complement that we did not have before. So as we moved on to other packages, we were speaking with authority, and we are speaking with authority. So it's actually a non-issue now. We've gotten down to stage. We do all this communication, which we now have the cycle all figured out how we do it, and not even a burp, not a blip, not a nothing. They're just like, oh yeah, okay. Because they see that they still get the material that they need in a timely fashion. Like we're working hard to make sure that the impact is not there. So it speaks also to the implications for the Canadian academic community, and that this isn't, and that was another big piece from watching from the sidelines, because I was involved in online learning at the time. I only had half an eye to what was happening with the library, to be honest, because I had my own issues I was dealing with. But it's clear in all the conversations that you're hearing at CAAL, at CARL, at CRKN, that this is a Canadian issue. This is, it's a world issue, but we're not in it alone. Memorial was not in it alone. And that also helped us. So one of the benefits coming out of this now, of course, is that they understand, our faculty and our administration and our grad students and our other students also have a greater understanding of the nuances of academic publishing, the environment and the important role that academic libraries play in the research cycle. And we've deepened our relationships with many of our faculty on campus. And so I have to tell you, I have such a tremendous amount of pride for the work that my folks did. They really did take this with, they took the hits because they had to, but they kept going. And because they always kept in mind what was important for our students and for our faculty, and they never lost sight of that. And they understood also the importance of being good stewards of the budget that we are allocated. And it's important as a public institution that we can point to something and say, we are not squandering away this money, we are doing the best that we can. And so the decisions were made with the information that we had available to us at the time. We have enhanced our data analysis expertise, we've improved our record keeping, and we came out of the experience with our reputation intact. In fact, I would argue that we earned some creds on the street. And I'm sure you would agree with me, Stephanie, on that. That we showed the value of what academic librarians bring to the whole experience, the academic experience. And we've stood by our decisions and the sound rationale that we used. And, you know, we've gotten respect for that. So from my experience as university librarian, I think there's still some variables that remain beyond our control. And this speaks to some of the Q&A that we had in the last conversation. The economic situations, the government directives, of course, we're the only university in Memorial in Newfoundland, our administrative priorities within our institution. Our job, as through the libraries, is that we help the university figure out these difficult times, and we protect the resources that students and faculty require to be productive in their research. And so this means that we have to start thinking about future viability and what we're going to do. So, you know, we have only one package left now. I should tell you, we did some other work after the packages. We also did some cleanup. We went in to look at our smaller packages. We've done everything now. And as I tell my provost, we've come right up to the cliff, and the only thing left is Elsevier. And yet, we are still in a position where we are projecting out now in 2 years that we will still have a deficit, and that number keeps moving. It's a moving target based on the Canadian dollar. But we are still looking at a very substantial deficit, shortfall, in 2-year time. And so what are we going to do about that? Many of us at CRKN last week and in conversations here during the coffee break are talking about, Memorial is very interested in the conversation, to have a conversation about Elsevier. You know, I don't want to kick them, but why not? I know Memorial's not alone in this. Now, obviously, certain institutions are more willing to have that conversation than others, but my provost wants us to nationally have a conversation about what we do. So I look forward to any and all discussions about that. And rest assured that Memorial will bring its expertise and the experience that we have acquired from going through this process to the table when we start to have those conversations. And my folks, I have to say, are absolutely tremendous, and they will bring value to that discussion for sure. How did I do? Pretty good. Is that really fast?
No, a few minutes over, I think. Remember, you were only supposed to talk for 15 minutes.
I could talk about 15 minutes.
I know. Do you want to throw to your colleagues to see if they have anything to add before we do the questions?
I think that's a great suggestion, Jen.
Okay.
Hi, what will we add? Are there any specific questions? Anything that wasn't covered that? I don't know.
We do have a question.
Hi, hi. It's Mark from Mount Allison again. How did going from managing a handful of packages to hundreds or thousands of one-off orders affect your staffing and your workflows? I know that for many of us in the 90s and before, we routinely did this sort of thing in a very different environment, and along came our pushers, and we got addicted, and we're now staffed for these kind of drugs. So the question is, how did you go cold turkey in terms of managing the stuff?
Well, yeah, so With packages, of course. We had, it was one subscription per package. It was easier to manage. So on the serials and acquisition side, their workload increased tremendously. And I don't know, Sue, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and the buybacks were done for the most part for the main library. They did them still by publisher. So although they weren't a package, they did all the individual buybacks for the publisher under the Health Sciences Library. And we did all ours to our agent at EBSCO. We just shipped them off the list and said this is what we're buying back and let them deal with it.
I think even trying to do what we did there is still an impact on human resources. So in some ways, Mark, what you're alluding to, which is quite right from my perspective, something I'm not particularly
I'm sorry, I'm missing that.
Oh, well, then why is that? I don't know.
Because I'm hard of hearing.
Oh, okay. What I was talking about was we're shifting the cost in some ways. And I'm not, there were things that we were trying to do to mitigate that impact on staff, but nevertheless, there's still an impact in terms of what we're doing. We're doing a lot of intervention. And as we move forward, I'm not sure what we're going to do about that, because we have a strategic planning process that we're working on, and there's a whole bunch of things that we're going to want to be working on, not cleaning up materials.
Follow-up question, since you've sort of anticipated where I was going with that. Do you have more people managing this stuff than you did 5 years ago?
No, I would say we probably, I'm going to say less. Yeah, we probably have less. I wasn't running the shop at that point. So I think the numbers are probably down, but my people could probably tell you that for sure.
Yeah, there are less people have retired, normal situations.
Hi, Amanda and Sue. Can you hear me? It's Suzanne.
Yes.
Hi. I'm just wondering how long the process took when you decided to start that. So you said 2014, and so I'm just wondering, were you able to do all of that within one academic year, or did it take longer?
With the CAALs, we put our, I'm looking around just in case I get the date wrong, in March of 2014 is when we made a proposal. No, 2015, or yes.
We informed in 2014, right? First recommendation, then the packages came at 15, and they were actually canceled.
Well, we had an extension that year because we were hoping to cancel in December of 2015, but that got pushed to January. We released the list, was it in November, to the university community, and then after that the fallout happened in the media, and we had information sessions and meetings with faculty after that. They submitted their suggestions and recommendations and feedback on that list. Then we massaged the list and adjusted it, and I think it was January 30th or so of 2016 that we actually canceled the 4 packages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a little bit less than a year? No, March to...
Yeah, it was the first time, yeah.
So not even
And the second time around, we had a full year because we would get the list, publisher, the list in early, January or February if possible. Stage was a little bit later getting your list to us, but we would have the message out by April, and then the feedback time, consultation period went until October for Taylor and Francis and September for Stage. So we give ourselves a bit more time this time around just because of, more of a sense of experience, more of a sense of how much time we actually need. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I know Donald has a question, but there's a question here as well. Can I get to that one first, Donald? You cool with that? Did you use some of the savings for your author publishing fund? I think the answer to that is no, but I could be mistaken on that.
That's correct. Yeah.
So that comes back to a comment that had been made in the first presentation around what is our obligation going forward to help change this paradigm. And Memorial has been committed all along for many, many years to have a healthy open access author fund. our fund is about $100,000, is not even about, it is $100,000. And some institutions are eliminating that author fund, but we have made a commitment institution that we would keep that, and I would suspect that my provost would not be very happy if I told her that we would be eliminating that open access author fund, and so we'd be having a conversation. Donald?
I was wondering, I've sort of heard anecdotally that there doesn't seem to be any real impact on interlibrary loan after big cancellations. Can you or your team comment on, was there an impact at all?
No, I don't believe so, but I'll let the team answer.
No, there's been no impact really. This is Erin Alcock. I will say there's one issue in that we're hearing a little bit more dissatisfaction from faculty members who are requesting more than one article from a single issue of a periodical, and we're still kind of sorting out how best to deal with that. But in terms of volume of interlibrary loan, I don't think that's really changed very much.
And we're not.
Some of the journals that were requested and indicated to be, essential haven't been requested through interlibrary loan, which is kind of telling. But we don't know how they're accessing those. And Stephanie touched on that.
So you have some understanding of what our library meetings look like. We're a lot of high energy. I don't think we're an anomaly, right? So other institutions are finding this as well. So which begs the question: were they actually getting the articles from us in the first place, right? And I don't know the answer to that. Mark, we're just going to give you a mic, man. You can just sit there.
I have a follow-up to Donald's, and it's to both of you really, and it's the specific subset of things that I'd be interested in would be scientific journals to which you end up now having like an embargo period. Are you seeing more ILL requests for things that are within the embargo period?
I think the answer, again, I'll let the team answer, but I think the answer is no.
That says something very interesting about our scientists, researchers' claims that they have to have the latest, greatest, doesn't it?
Don't take my word for it, though.
Like we said before, the journals that a lot of our respondents indicated to be essential, that they couldn't live without the embargo, that wasn't an option. We just haven't received a lot of loan requests for those either. We basically canceled everything that we had with an embargo just because to make the list manageable. The actual buyback list, if it had an embargo, it was canceled, and yet, not a lot of needs, not a lot of requests for the current year content that was lost. So who knows? They, like I said before, they're probably getting it. We just don't know where or how. But it's not through our interlibrary loan system.
What I would add is that when we negotiate, we always look at the GR5 counter reports, and it depends of the big deals, but it is really interesting to see that in some of them, 80% of the downloads are done on retrospective content. So embargo do not matter. So it depends. It's not all the big deals the same, but it is very important to look at those stats because you get interesting answers to your community and interesting things to ask to the publishers with those stats.
Hi, it's Leslie at UNB. Well, Leslie from UNB at Acadia. One of the aspects that we have speculated on and would be very interested in understanding better is whether reducing access to the current scientific material disadvantages graduate students more than faculty who have their own networks. And if they're looking for something, they just need to reach out to a colleague, and they very quickly, at another institution, many of whom work more closely with people at other places than they do internally anyway, so that they're quickly okay, and they're not going to bother with ILL. They've got their own. They've got their own systems and networks, but that grad students who don't have those networks yet are losing out to a greater degree. But you know, it's not an evidence-based comment. It's more just but it's something that we would like to understand better.
Yes, so it shows a way to know that, to determine the effect of all this on those students, on that portion of our population. I know that, you know, in all the cancellation projects, the graduate students have been vocal. They have submitted their feedback and their comments, so they're out there and they know how to reach us, but I personally haven't heard from a lot of grad students, you know, as a way to say that maybe they have been more negatively impacted than other members of our community, but I don't know. It'd be nice to know, and if that is the case, what we could do about it. I guess, you know, they know about our interlibrary loan system. Nothing's been requested of significance, so I have no idea.
What we know is that they have other networks. They have Twitter. There is this hashtag PDF as I don't know that I don't remember. Yeah, I can ask PDF. So they have other resources. Yeah.
So we have
just a note. Oh, sorry. I can't tell if I'm talking over anybody or not. We recently spoke with our Oxford rep, who indicated that the usage now hasn't changed at all, really, from our usage before we canceled the journals, the ones that we canceled from that package. So that was an interesting little stat. Yeah, so the usage has stayed about the same, so which tells us that the ones that we decided to buy back through Oxford were probably good decisions.
never doubted it for a second.
If I can add, interestingly, the same type of discussion we are not with CRKN for Elsevier, and when we began discussion for the renewal, they told us, we think your new collection, because we still have core collection, your collection that we have changed with the methodology is pretty performant, because before your usage was 50% of the usage were in Freedom Collection and 50% on our core, and now it's almost 80, 85, and 90% in our core. So it's a devaluation of their concept of Freedom Collection. That is pretty interesting. Yeah.
We have a question online. So given most libraries' role in copyright, are you making, so I guess it's a question to both of us, are you making any extra efforts to make sure faculty don't get the articles from underground sources? Sci-Hub was mentioned. There's also a news item recently where publishers were approaching ResearchGate for providing illegal access to articles. So copyright is, there's many facets to this whole conversation, right? So if you think about the bubbles that are going on, we have this copyright conversation happening with York and what's happening in Quebec, and institutions have got to figure out what we're doing about that. So there's a responsibility for us to make sure that we do have conversations with faculty members about adhering to the practice that we have established within our organization, as well as copyright law. But we are not, at Memorial anyway, we do not police it, nor I will never take on that role. But we are advocates and we do the best we can around that. Could we be doing more? Definitely. Will we be doing more? Yes. Than what we're doing right now, but we have yet to figure that out. You got anything else?
No, because we our future depends of legal access. I don't know how to say that, but it's as important for us than for them. So we have to continue to keep on teaching and giving them the good path, but we don't want to play police neither.
We still, for our scheduled time, we still have about 10 more minutes of conversation. Are there any other questions?
I'm curious if whether or not you conducted negotiations with the publishers whose packages you canceled titles to get some kind of discount on titles you reinstated, or if you're just essentially paying list price now for all the titles you reinstated.
Great question. I'll let the team. I know they did negotiate.
With the CAAL, so, Cambridge, Oxford, Wiley, Springer, we were kind of new to it. By the time Taylor and Francis rolled around, we had learned a few lessons from the CAALs, and we did go back to Taylor and Francis. At the time, they didn't give us any, if I'm remembering this right, they didn't give us any real options other than single title buybacks. So for Stage, though, they did tell us about the packages, the smaller subject packages. So that's something that we've been looking at for this particular package. Would be more cost effective to buy back some of the smaller subject packages. And then once Stage is over, we do want to revisit Taylor and Francis, then look back at the CAAL. So I think we were new in the beginning. We learned a few things as the processes went along, and now I think we're more able to go back and look at Taylor and Francis again and just see what we can do. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
Taylor and Francis was really playing hardball, because when we heard that, I think it was Calgary had been able to negotiate a deal, we went back to them and asked them, and they said the only way that we could do that would be if we bought back and went back into the package with everything that we had had before for another full year, and then they would think about negotiating something else with us. So we just dropped that whole thing, said we'll stay the course for what we have for now and look at it again in a year or two.
Yeah, when we're not so enthralled in Sage, and we're not completely involved in this process, we'll look back at Taylor and Francis and see if they can look back at that and reconsider.
Good, thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks to my folks for coming on board and making sure that they were available to answer the Q&A. And I will speak for them to say that if you have any other questions about what we did at Memorial and what we're doing at Memorial, I know they would be more than willing to help you out. Is that right, guys?
Yes, that's right.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Well, it doesn't hurt to get out early either, though I did get an update from a friend that the food truck rally has been canceled because of weather. Oh. I know. Apparently it's supposed to, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So that's too bad. But lots of restaurants, lots of activity, so you can try that out. Up next is Craig Olsvik. Craig is a senior content licensing officer at CRKN. He's responsible for administrating the content program, including coordinating the negotiation process, ongoing contract management, and license maintenance support. Craig performs staff support for the Content Strategy Committee, that we all know him from, and other committees and task groups, as well as oversees the frontline member services function. He joined CRKN, the CRKN team in May 2011 as member services and licensing officer, and moved to his current position in January 2013. Craig is a graduate from DAL, yay, and has previously worked at St. Mary's University. Thanks, Craig. Yeah.
sounds different to me at least than it usually does. Maybe it sounds the same to you. And secondly, that a lot of you at least were at the AGM last week in Montreal, so you might have heard a lot of this very recently already, so I apologize for that. But hopefully those of you who weren't there and those of you who were on the phone or on a teleconference will get some new information. So in speaking with Cynthia a few weeks ago, well, I guess maybe more than a month ago, about what we wanted to cover, what she wanted me to cover at this, there we go, the other way, down. So down goes to the next slide. These are some of the things that that she wanted me to cover and that we, in discussion with her, thought would be best for CRKN to talk about. So again, some of this might be old news for a lot of you, but just briefly about what the Content Strategy Committee is and how we can arrive at our negotiation objectives and what that process looks like. And then moving into some of the things that CRKN is doing about trying to at least get to start to address some of the issues that we're all discussing today at this forum. So that's the License Transition Task Group, that's the TDR Task Group, that's just brand new. And then I wanted to get into a little bit about a summary of some of the big deal cancellations that have happened overseas from CRKN members over the last 2 or 3 years, to give you sort of a big picture of who's actually making these cancellations, what that looks like, and so forth. And also with the opt-out clauses now that we have in our licenses, giving you an idea of how often that actually has been used, by what institutions and for what contracts and so forth. And then also wanting to talk about a bit about what's happening internationally with this type of thing, what other consortia are doing with regards to big deals and whether they're canceling them or changing them in some way or trying to do certain things. And then wrapping up with just letting you know what there's like an update in terms of what the negotiations that are happening right now for these big 3 main ones, which is Wiley, Olsvik, and Sage, which again, those of you who are at the AGM will have heard of this already. But maybe this is an opportunity to ask questions if you didn't get a chance last week. So the negotiation process, this is a quick infographic. I'm not sure if you can read it, but I'll explain it a little bit if you can't read it. So what's important, I think, to mention here is that the information gathering process for us is probably one of the most important parts, and it sort of happens throughout the entire process. So that's why it's sort of extending across that entire graphic there. So that includes, well, I guess our old process back in the day when I first started at CRKN was you started the year with a series of surveys for the renewals that were happening that year. And we had okay participation in that. I mean, it wasn't great, it wasn't bad, it was sort of middle of the road. But what we found over the last couple of years, we changed that process a little bit in terms of actually having a discussion with the membership at the beginning of the year rather than just shooting a survey to them and sort of assuming what questions they wanted us to ask them. So what we do now is actually hold a teleconference at the beginning of the year. It's usually focused on like what we expect the most difficult renewals to be, usually the biggest deals. And then following those teleconferences up with a series of surveys that include questions that are drafted based on the feedback we got during those sessions. We also have various of our people at the team, other than myself. This is not my area of expertise. Well, perhaps it is getting more so these days, but stats and analytics in terms of looking at the JVA report we put together, and now more recently the JVP. So trying to look at that and use some statistics, that type of thing, to see what information and trends we can glean from that. Also conducting consultations with other consortia, so CAAL, ECI, ECI, OCAL, and COPAL, and then also internationally as well with the ICOLC, the group of consortia across the globe. And then moving past that information gathering stage, moving towards the actual negotiations. So we have a board of, I'm not going to try to remember how many exact members are on it, about 10. Also the Content Strategy Committee, which I'll get into more detail on the next slide. But we have their input and their expertise. A number of them are here today, obviously, as we've heard. They're assigned to specific renewals each year, so there's subgroups of the CSC that's focused on specific contracts that are up for renewal. That way we can have, we don't have to schedule 10 members of a committee to be involved in each individual negotiation, which as you can imagine can be a bit difficult to achieve. Obviously the member input that we've gathered to that point is a very important part of the negotiations, and the objectives that we develop based on that feedback that we've received from the membership. So moving into the actual negotiation meetings with the series of proposals from them and counter proposals from us. In the past, we sort of started the process usually with an RFP to the publisher. What we've found in the last few number of years, it's worked a bit better, I think, to our advantage, I hope, is that we actually send them our proposal from the outset saying, these are the issues that we think are top of mind for us and for the membership, and we want you to respond to that rather than giving them the first shot at whatever the idiom we want to use, first crack at the baseball bat or the baseball. Obviously, I'm not into sports, you can tell from my analogy. So once the negotiations are concluded and we feel like we have some sort of offer that we can go to the membership with, that moves us to the offer to the membership stage, which is pretty much where we are right now with most of the renewals. We're getting close to that, hopefully. So that involves getting financial commitments from all the members for the licenses they wish to renew, executing the license, and moving to the invoicing stage. I'll just briefly put up on the slides what we call the first principles of negotiation that were developed by the CSC a number of years ago. They pretty much guide our overall practice in terms of what we look to achieve during negotiations for a renewal or a new license for that matter. Those being that members must achieve better pricing in terms of conditions of usage inside a CRKN license agreement compared to what they could achieve independently from the vendor. It's usually pretty easy to satisfy that one. There are some cases where, for example, in the CRKN renewal, it's been a very difficult one for us because it's French language focused content, where the Anglophone institutions actually get a very much more beneficial price for that content than the people who actually use it, which is the Francophone or the bilingual institutions. So in a lot of cases, if we were to cancel that license altogether, it could be the case where certain institutions could get actually a better deal outside the license than they could within. So that particular negotiation has been a tough one. Number two, notwithstanding diversity of size, programs, and budgets, etc. of our members, CRKN should ensure that on any given license agreement, all members achieve a significant and fair discount from the vendor standard institutional price. I'm sure we're all aware that it's difficult sometimes to measure that about how appropriate or accurate an indicator that a vendor's institutional price actually is and what someone should pay or what someone could pay. And also it's difficult sometimes to define what a significant and fair discount is. But we certainly strive to make sure that we accommodate number two as much as we possibly can, given the metrics we have to measure that. And finally, as much as possible and in alignment with best practice internationally, we should aim at our vendor negotiations to achieve both discounted total price as well as a cost breakdown for members that meet CRKN objectives. So that's kind of going back to the issue that we sort of tried to address a number of years ago with the cost sharing advisory group, which is to move away from cost sharing as much as we could, because in that sort of mechanism, it's difficult to, especially in an environment right now where we have members leaving agreements, that can sometimes cause problems for members who stay on agreements because their prices are tied to the overall whole. So if someone leaves, that slice of that package has to go somewhere else, which means members' prices can increase as a result of that cancellation. So the Content Strategy Committee, this will just give you a brief overview of the composition as it stands right now. The appointment process is done by regional consortia right now, as it's always been done, I believe. So 2 representatives from each of the 4 regions, plus a chair and a vice chair. As you can see, we actually have pretty good representation, I think, from across the CRKN bands. So of the 13 bands that we have members on this committee from most of those bands, sort of from 5 and above. We don't have anyone from the smaller universities right now, so hopefully in the future we can try and accommodate that and address that. To address one particular, area that, not disadvantaged, but something we wanted to improve in terms of the composition, we've actually added a band balance position on the CSC just recently. So now we have someone dedicated from band 13 on the Content Strategy Committee, which is being filled right now by Wei Jing Wan from the University of Toronto. I think that's all I wanted to say about composition of CSC. But I guess just more broadly to say that their role in CRKN's operations is to really ensure that the membership is represented during the negotiations. It's not just staff going off and doing this type of work on our own. We have good feedback from yourselves working through that and the regional consortium. This slide shows our membership by band, so you can see that Obviously, Band 6 there has the most members, followed by Band 10. I think, you can see that the majority of members are focused in the middle through Bands 5 to 11. There's a bit of a valley, and Bands 8 and 9, there's a bit of a dip there. The banding structure gets updated on an annual basis using the 3 factors that we've historically used for all of our cost-sharing arrangements, which is FTE, faculty numbers, and research funding. Oh, and I also should mention, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but now the CRKN membership fees are also based on the banding system. This chart shows license expenditure by memberships, so broken down by band. So obviously, probably logically, this may not be a surprise. The majority of license expenditure happens in the higher bands. But what I think is also interesting too is that you can see that University of Toronto accounts for 8% of the total expenditure of CRKN just by themselves, being alone in band 13. So almost half of the next band down, which is band 12, could be UT matches half of the next smallest band. We also have a significant, you can see that significant expenditure is actually mostly in band 10, which has 13 members. This slide, maybe I should have left this for the end, closer to what I'm talking about the current status of the renewals, but just because we're talking about CC, I thought it would be useful to mention this now. These are the objectives that were drafted by the content strategy committee for all of the renewals this year. So these aren't license specific; these are broadly for all of the contracts that we're renewing for 2018. So these were drafted with input from the member teleconferences that we held earlier this year. Those teleconferences were focused mainly on Wiley, Sage, and Elsevier, but these objectives also apply to others that are to phase 1. Probably most notable is the addition of the objective that I've highlighted in red, which is, I think, for the first time that we've had this objective. Might have done it last year. I should have reminded myself that was the case, but we're targeting specifically targeting alternative options to the big deals, which can often compete a little bit with the objective to minimize cost increases overall for the big deal. But hearing feedback from membership that this is something you want us to pursue, we wanted to make that a main objective for the renewals this year. What makes that difficulty really strong, I think, is that the publishers, as you may have experienced yourselves in negotiations, tend to try to force libraries to remain in the big deals as much as possible in order to secure their projected revenues, because they want to maintain the revenue they used to receive. Also of note, I think here, you might have noticed on your financial commitment form for Wiley that came out last week, is that we're offering the option for institutions to pay in US dollars for the first time. Actually, for the second time, we did last year, actually, with one license. But for all 3 of these phase 1s, we're offering the option to pay US dollars, which is, I think, is something new. Those of you who have US dollar accounts at your institutions that can take advantage of that, hopefully that's something that's helpful. And if it's successful this year, we have a lot of members taking that option. Certainly something we look forward to extending in the future as well. I'm going to move to the License Transition Task Group. So I stole these slides from a colleague's presentation at the AGM, because I'm not actually involved in this particular task group, but hopefully I do justice to Jason's slides and the task group. But you can see on the slide here sort of the 2 main goals for the License Transition Task Group. The terms of reference for this group were approved by the Board of Directors in January 2017, and they've been working all of this year towards these 2 goals. So those are to propose options for the CSC to explore negotiations as alternatives to full big deal participation within a CRK negotiated deal. It's phrased a bit oddly, but essentially they're trying to recommend options that the CSC should pursue in the license renewal negotiations, aside from full big deal participation. But then also to suggest to CRKN how we can better support members who choose those alternatives, and who choose to exit the CRKN journal licenses. This is the membership. So Heather McMullen is chair from Queens. We also have Alison Amby from MUN, Samuel Cassidy from Western, Patty Galloway from Simon Fraser, Wendy Merkley from Lethbridge, Chantal St. Louis, who's going to be joining the CSC very soon, actually, from Laval, and Rob Thiessen from Calgary. These individuals are drawn from CRKN's member institutions, either with recent experience in or who anticipate having to exercise either an opt-in clause in a CRKN license, or perhaps We had a nominations process, and the CSC selected who they felt were the best candidates, trying to balance out size of institution, experience, so forth and so forth. They've had 10 meetings today, actually, with one in-person meeting in Ottawa. They had a presentation last week in Montreal, and looking to submit their final report to the CSC, I think at the November meeting next month. Talking a bit about their methodology and what the results are that they found. They did a member survey that I think possibly many of you answered. It was June 27th to the 18th of July. They had 47 respondents, 32% of which had exited a big deal. I assume a CRKN big deal. 70% were considering exiting a big deal in 2017 for 2018 content, so the renewals that we're currently negotiating. Approximately 60% of those respondents described the following big deal alternatives as the most important or very important. So the concept of a little big deal, which is described as a common base package with the ability to add individual titles with a consortium discount. So trying to reduce the size of the big deal in order to save funds or save on the fees. And secondarily, the title by title selection with a consortium discount. In terms of key findings, and again, I'm going to hope to summarize these to the best of my ability, having not actually worked with the group very much. The first one being CRK members use a variety of collection analysis methods, of which we heard a lot about this morning. So usage data, overlap analysis, faculty publishing, survey data, getting input from faculty about what journals they think are important, and so forth. But there was actually no clear consensus on the best approach to licensing. There was also strong support for the current big deal from a lot of respondents. As I mentioned, a smaller CRKN-specific tailored base package, and also discounted title by title selection. Probably not coming as a surprise to anyone was that perpetual access remains very important to members, because in a cancellation scenario, that access is going to be all that more important. And I think very important as well is that CRK members want case studies from their fellow members, which is part of the reason we're here today, I think. So look for more from that group next month in their final report. A little bit fresher and more in my wheelhouse because I'm a staff support for this committee is the Trusted Digital Repository Task Group. So this group was formed quite a bit after the LTTG. It was around May, I think, when they actually finally got off the ground after the nominations process. But the overall objective of the group is up there on your screen. It's develop a framework, including a service model, or a governance model, or a cost-sharing model, or a fee for service model for establishing a national TDR for CRK members for journal content and possibly other content down the road, but specifically for journals going at the outset, to ensure that long-term access to licensed content and resources that CRKN has negotiated for, and to provide, I think, maybe the most important part is that it's a publisher and a mechanism for exercising post-cancellation rights. And so this has sort of been a long time coming. Those of you who've been in your positions for a long time may remember the perpetual access task group that CRKN had, less than 5 years ago now, that had a final report suggesting that we pursue this very thing. As time went on, other things became more other priorities, and staff changes at OVAL, staff changes at CRKN made sure that this was sort of put on the back burner for a little bit. We actually are finally getting some momentum around this right now with this task group. What else do I mention? I think I won't go into too much detail about that particular objective other than let's move to the next slide and say these are the members of the task group currently, chaired by Leslie Weir from University of Ottawa. We have Corey Davis from Copley, who's their digital preservation coordinator. We have Kate Davis from Scholars Portal, Emily Fortin from Laval, Scott Gillies from Wilfrid Laurier, Jeff Carter from Alberta, Kristen Cruz from Manitoba, Glenn Morales from UT, and also Caitlin Tillman from UT. So this is actually, I think, our largest task group, mostly because there's so many different players, I think, that are involved in this process. So it's been very important to include representatives from those various stakeholders and lots of areas of expertise, as well as digital preservation, perpetual access, licensing, finance with Glenn Morales as business manager at UT. In addition to those individuals, we also extended the group a bit more broadly because that larger task group has been broken up into subgroups focusing on different areas, so licensing, digital preservation, communications, and other areas like that. So we have these individuals supporting the task group. They're not official members of the task group, but we're sort of sitting there and helping out as needed. So Claire, obviously, CRKN's the executive director, participates as needed. John Barnett, executive director at OCL as well. Jesse Carliner, who's the communications librarian at UT, has been helping on the communications front, as has Annika Ward from OCL. Alan Jarnell from Scholars Portal, and Grant Hurley from Scholars Portal as well, and myself, I'm the main staff support person from CRKN working with this task group. So to tell you a little bit practically what we're looking at with this task group, what we're trying to achieve, the functionality of a national TDR for CRKN would sort of, I guess it would function as a light archive, because that's how Scholars Portal currently functions. It would actually be a bit difficult for us for local, specifically in Scholars Portal, to have a light archive for their own members, and then sort of a dark archive trigger event kind of thing for members across Canada. So the idea is that if this service goes forward, all CRKN members would have Scholars Portal as, they could choose to use it as an access point for journal content, but we assume that most people would probably just use it as a preservation point and perpetual access point in a situation of cancellation, or a situation where a publisher should go out of business, or a particular journal should cease publishing. So that's to say that the access function is there, but we assume that most libraries probably wouldn't use it outside of Ontario. In terms of services, obviously the main one would be post-termination access. So, for example, to take a practical example, a number of years ago, the Sweats license got out of business, and all their content was no longer accessible for CRKN's license. If that were to happen with a service of this caliber in place, you would have an access point for all that material. So you wouldn't have to have individual negotiations with all the different publishers that were under that aggregator. You could just go to Scholars Portal and say, hey, turn on my access. It would already be turned on. You could just say, do that. You could activate in your knowledge base or your link resolver Scholars Portal links for that content. Obviously, preservation is a very big component of the whole Scholars Portal ethos. They're very knowledgeable about that, much more knowledgeable than I am, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. But digital preservation is also another service that we provide by hosting that content locally on Scholars Portal in a Canadian solution to that as well. And I think the third thing that would be, I think, beneficial in this type of scenario would be enhanced services like text and data mining. So you can actually think about doing TDM across not just a particular publisher's corpus of material, but all publishers, across a certain discipline, across all publishers, for example. So having negotiated the rights to do that and having that content loaded locally on Scholars Portal will allow, hopefully, the researchers to do that type of more in-depth analysis. A bit about what we're envisioning the structure to look like. It's kind of it's a bit complex because University of Toronto Libraries actually act as the service provider to OCL for Scholars Portal, so they have to be very much engaged in this process. There would be assuming a lot of the legal risk should a service like this be extended outside of Ontario. So there would have to be some kind of service agreement with UTL and with CRKN, and OCL probably as a third party to that agreement. Obviously, it has large implications for the licensing process at CRKN. They're going to have to negotiate for local load rights for all of this content, which is something we don't presently do. Generally, what a license does is says, with a publisher, CRKN and this publisher agree that the publisher will go into OCL and negotiate a third-party local loading license with OCL in good faith. But obviously, if we offer a service such as this with Scholars Portal, we have to do that from the outset, which I think we're prepared to do and willing to do. It does raise the issue of how important a priority is local hosting and local loading versus getting the best price for a particular package. There's a bit of a dynamic that we have to account for. And obviously, it's early days in terms of figuring out what the actual financials would be for this type of service, but looking at that very closely, trying to determine whether that would be based on CRKN bands, but it's also important as well to look at making sure that we're recognizing the significant investment that local libraries have already put into Scholars Portal as a service, and making sure that that's recognizing whatever financial model that we end up recommending to the board of directors that should this go forward. Okay, I'm going to move on from TDR-TG. So this is for 2016, and specifically the Atlantic region. So you can see that obviously we already heard about CAAL, which I'm picking up different acronyms now. CAAL is good. So Cambridge, Oxford, and Wiley Spring at Memorial. We also had a number of cancellations across the rest of the Atlantic provinces. I've highlighted in red the ones that aren't actually big deals, technically, if you want to.
Yeah, your slides on advance.
Oh, my apologies. There we go, this is the correct slide. So the ones that are in red are the ones that aren't technically big deals. They're big licenses, they're costly products, but they're not journals or they're not a whole package or portfolio from the publisher, so I just wanted to make sure that we're calling them big deals. So you can see there have been a few. I mean, obviously Memorial was at the most for 2016, but also Université de Montréal also canceled participation in 3 licenses as well, Cambridge, Oxford, and RSC. Next up, in Quebec, a bit more significant in terms of the number of institutions, I think, that made cancellations in that year. Again, the ones in red are the ones that are journal big deals. Thomson Reuters, Web of Science, and Web of Knowledge being the main culprit there. But also Scopus had a cancellation at Laval, and AMS, the American Mathematics Society, Math SciNet product, had a number of cancellations at 2 of the smaller institutions in Quebec. In Ontario, things were a bit more business as usual. We had a couple of cancellations, but nothing really widespread. The major ones being at Trent, where they canceled participation in 3. Some of the smaller big deals that you might want to call them, so not the big 5, but some of the tinier ones. And in the West, a bit more than Ontario, probably a bit more than the Atlantic as well, but mostly single cancellations per institution, which only 2 examples there was really multiple cancellations from a couple of institutions in Regina and UNBC. But all of these are actually big deal journal packages because they're available, as you can see. So those were for, so not the 2016, but these are actually licenses that were for 2016, but they were new in 2015. So the ones that, we actually only had one major big deal that was under renewal during calendar year 2016 for calendar year 2017, and that was Taylor and Francis. So here I've put together, one slide, the list of cancellations for TNAP that we had for calendar year starting January 1, 2017. So one full cancellation of that product across the board, the CRKN, and the same for Bishops and UDM and UNBC. For Calgary, they canceled, I had a partial cancellation, so they canceled the Social Sciences and Humanities portion of that license, but kept the S&T, the Science and Technology, and the medical collections, and also licensed a number of smaller subject packages in the SSH area to supplement what they kept in the license. Similar situation for Western, but they canceled the medical package and kept access to the traditional TMF stuff. So the SSH and the S&T. We also did have one institution that joined the license for the first time, which was St. Mary's, and they joined for the SSH portion of the license. In terms of the opt-outs, I guess a bit of background on this. 2 years ago was the first time we had added opt-out clauses to CRKN licenses. So prior to that, if you signed a deal for 3 years, you were pretty much stuck for 3 years unless there was some major calamity that happened, which never happened in my experience. But hearing from member feedback, a lot of concern about growing costs and sustainability of participation and so forth, we started to negotiate opt-out clauses into the license about 2 years ago. So for Springer, Cambridge, Taylor, and Francis, we had opt-out clauses for 2017. These are the institutions that decided to exercise those clauses, those opt-outs. So for Springer, we had Algoma cancel for 2018. And then for Cambridge, we had Algoma, Athabasca, and OCAD cancel participation for next year. And for Taylor and Francis, we actually had no institutions decide to opt out for next year. In terms of what I've been hearing about what's going on abroad with big deals, and mostly focused primarily on consortia because that's sort of my area of work and expertise and knowledge. Surely there are a lot of individual institutions that are conducting cancellation exercises published in open access by the researchers of their institutions. So what their deal for the 3 years that they have it ending next year, what it does is it combines their 2014 spend on APC charges for their authors, plus a top-up fee for subscription access to the rest of the articles that they wouldn't have access to because they are openly available. So all institutions at JISC participating institutions can publish in Springer journals without additional APC charges, and those APC fees are capped at what the 2014 levels were. So actually, if the publication counts exceed that level of 2014, you can actually say that institution has effectively saved money because they're only paying for the number of articles that has been published up to that certain capped level that they examined in 2014. In the Netherlands, actually, they're doing a very similar thing. So with their Wiley agreement, the VSNU, which is the Association of Dutch Universities, so it's not actually a library organization because the university administration in the Netherlands is actually very much involved in the negotiations for the big deals in that country, which is, as you might think, is very beneficial. So they had an agreement with Wiley for their 13 libraries at their 13 institutions for 2016 through 2019. They have their contract is public, so you can go on their website, you can read their contract if you're interested to do so, which includes their price increases as well, which are 3.5% per year. They, again, similar to JISC, they have 100% OA publication rights for their institutional authors, corresponding authors. So it's the same flipping model as JISC has. They have what their subscription fees were, plus, what their open access publication fees were for a particular year, when they have a top-up fee to cover everything else. Moving on to Germany, you probably have heard in the press a lot about what's happening there, was particularly with the Elsevier negotiations. So they're taking a very strong stance against Elsevier. They're aiming to establish a nationwide license agreement for German institutions with an OA component, so similar to JISC and the Dutch. So those negotiations with Elsevier have actually escalated to a point now where many German institutions have canceled their contracts, which is very interesting, and we're watching that very closely, obviously. Faculty are actually also resigning from editorial boards with Elsevier journals, which I think is also a very, it's going to have an effect, hopefully. The outcome, obviously, is to be determined, so the negotiations are, I think, stalled at the moment. I don't think they're talking, but hopefully at some point they get back to the table and some progress is made. And finally, I'll talk a bit about what not what the French are doing, but what the consortium in France has conducted a study about libraries in Southern European countries, and what they're thinking about is OA 2020. Actually, I should ask, who's familiar with what OA 2020 is? Just Stephanie and Leslie? Okay. So in Berlin, every year they have an open access conference in Berlin. A number of years ago, there was this white paper that was published by the Max Planck Digital Library in Germany. And their whole idea was that there's actually enough money in subscriptions globally to cover APC charges to make all articles that are published in the scholarly realm open access. So that's their contention. They think there's enough money in the system to do that. The difficulty is actually getting there and transitioning each individual country to do that. Because you can imagine if one country does it and no one else does, then their articles are going to be open, but no one else will do it. So you're still going to have to pay subscription costs to get access to the stuff that hasn't flipped. So CRKN in France, actually, I was in Prague for the ICLub conference just before the AGM 2 weeks ago, and an individual from CRKN presented on this. They did a little study with CAAL, which is the Southern European Library Link. So it involves consortium libraries from France, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Turkey, and Italy, I think are the main ones. So the study was meant to examine the practical effects of implementing this OA 2020 idea in CEL institutions, so those Southern European Library institutions. So to sort of test that theory that OA transformation is possible at no additional cost above what the global institutions are paying for subscriptions. So what they did was they took the number of articles published in 2015 with corresponding authors at institutions in their respective countries. And multiplied those number of articles by the APC that was specified in that OA 2020 white paper, which was €2,000. And the study determined that in all countries except for Turkey, it would actually cost libraries more, in some cases 5% more, in other cases up to 73% more, to pay for its country's OA publications instead of paying the traditional subscription model. So taking a detailed look at France's figures, it's sort of all over the map. They looked at their individual publishers, but for the largest publishers like Elsevier or Wiley, France could possibly save a bit of money for those who factoring in the smaller publishers like APS, ACS, RSC, and those smaller big deals. They would actually pay much more in OA fees for those published articles than they would for what they're actually paying if the current subscription rates for their big deals. So also taking into account all major publishers for which they have licenses, the overall effect is a cost increase of roughly 7% to pay APCs for all articles with corresponding authors at French institutions. And this study assumes, of course, that all other countries also flip to the same model. Otherwise, like I mentioned, subscription costs would have to be applied on top of that to make sure that you have access to articles that are published by French corresponding authors. So all that to say, really, that I think Canada is maybe a little bit unique in terms of its consortia and its members actually looking at trying to reduce costs of the big deal overall. Whereas, at least in Europe, things may be different in the States. They tend to be much more heavily focused on open access and trying to flip the model, and less focused on trying to save money. I think part of that has to do with a lot of infrastructure they have in Europe. You know, they're organized very much nationally. They have central funding for a lot of these projects and so forth. That to the extent that we don't have that here, certainly they don't have that to the extent in the U.S. as well. So to close, talk a bit about the current status of the 2017 license renewals. But again, with apologies to those who saw these slides last week. So for Sage Premier, we're looking at 2% increases over the next 3 years, from 2018 through 2020. We do have a foreign exchange mechanism negotiated to reduce price increases in the second and third years if, again, the Canadian dollar decides to weaken again, which we hope it doesn't, of course. We're changing from a subscription maintenance model to one of annual reconciliation, which I think there are pros and cons to both models, but we heard loud and clear during earlier this year at the conferences that the subscription maintenance model is actually much more onerous and burdensome than the traditional reconciliation model. So this will be the first time we actually have a reconciliation with Sage, but hopefully it will actually improve upon the workflows and staff time devoted to managing the Sage license that we have through CRKN. We've negotiated a 20% price cap on list price increases for titles that transfer to Sage. This is actually a unique thing for the Sage license, which we don't have in any other licenses. So, for example, when Elsevier or Wiley or Taylor and Francis or whomever, if they take over a journal from another publisher, they have carte blanche to increase the price of that title, the list price of that title by whatever percentage they want. And we have no real defense mechanism against that. So this allows us to at least cap it to not a good level, but at least up to some level. The impetus for negotiating this was actually last year, and the year before that, Sage had a number of price increases to titles that they took over that were in excess of 100% in some cases. So now we at least have this in terms of some protection. We also have an agreement with Sage that if we can provide examples of proof to them that member A through CRKN paid price B through publisher C in the last year, they've actually honored what the actual member paid rather than reverting to a list price. So if a member paid $1,000 for a subscription with the former publisher, they would only pay $1,000 plus 2% going forward. But as you can imagine, we have to have some sort of mechanism to prove that. So it'll be easiest in cases where titles transfer from one CRKN publisher to another, because we have that information and background that we can provide to Sage and say, hey, this institution paid this cost last year, so the price should only go up by such and such amount for next year. In terms of alternative options that we've been able to negotiate, so going back to that objective of negotiating for options aside from the big deal of the entire package, we have a fixed list option. So those of you who want to sort of hold the line of what the premier list is going to be for next year and not have transfer titles move into the license on an annual basis, you'll be able to do that and just have a static list of content for 3 years with no transfers, and that'll give you some cost containment and some predictability, hopefully. There will also be an option for subject packages. There will be an additional CRKN discount for those. Unfortunately, the way Sage calculates their pricing. They do it based on what subscriptions you have currently to titles that are within a subject package, and then they top it up based on FTE and some other factors. So that will actually require some custom quotes. So if your institution is interested in pursuing a subject package, then get in touch with me and we start that process with Sage. Unfortunately, Sage does not entertain the idea of having a title-by-title selection option within the contract, despite our insistence that they do so. They just wouldn't go down that road, unfortunately, so we haven't been able to offer that as an option for this contract. They would obviously offer that on an individual basis, but I'm assuming that would be on a list price basis, but you may have more success negotiating with them if that's a decision you have to make in the institution. The 40% discount on APCs that we negotiated for the last contract will continue, and we also have an opt-out clause for the first time in the Sage contract, so you'll be able to exercise that in the second and third year of the contract, should you choose to do so. And for Wiley Blackwell, we're continuing with the database with Wiley. We also have an option to cancel participation in the database and revert to a core collection model. But for those who stay in the database, and actually equally for those who revert to the core collection model, the price increases would be 0% in the first year for the database, but then 2% in the second year and 2% in the third year. Again, we have a foreign exchange mechanism to reduce those price increases in that second and third year should the Canadian dollar reduce or lose value compared to where it is right now. In terms of the option to exit the database, we were able to achieve the option to have title-by-title selection. Unfortunately, that's about where the achievement kind of ends, because we're not particularly happy with the discounts we were able to achieve. But nonetheless, we were able to achieve some discounts on volume discounts on title-by-title selection. So you can see on the slide there that if you choose to reduce your spend and revert to title selection, the maximum you're able to do so would be to save 25% off your current license spend with Wiley and go down to 75% of your current license fee in the number of value of titles that you choose to select. And if you were to do so, you'd be able to get a 12.5% discount off of Wiley list price for the titles that you would just select using that option. And similarly for 80% or 90%, if you spend 80% of your current license fee, you get a slightly higher discount on title-by-title selection at 17.5%. And if you only reduce your fee by 10%, you get a 27.5% discount off of list price for titles that you select. Should you choose one of those options, those titles will have to be maintained until the end of the contract, so until the end of 2020. There will be a 10% swapping allowance, so going back to Stephanie's recommendation to swap titles of value with your core collection, you'll be able to do that up to 10% of the total value of your core subscriptions. And similarly with Sage, we'll have an opt-out for the Wiley license for 2019 and 2020. For Elsevier, as you might expect, they were particularly difficult negotiations, and they continue to be particularly difficult negotiations. We actually agreed on pricing terms. Oh my God, it must be more than a month ago now. The next step was to proceed to the actual negotiations of the license language itself in the model license. And I still haven't received a copy back from them about what their requested modifications are, so that's still ongoing. In terms of our priorities of negotiation objectives, it's a bit of a competition. It has been a bit of a competition between getting that lowest price increase for the big deal, knowing that this is the most expensive contract for all CRKN members, versus negotiating for some of those alternative options that you all are looking for, or that some of you are looking for. I think what informed our decision, or eventually the board's decision to focus on the big deal and getting the lowest price for that option, is that two things. Essentially, that there were few CRKN members that indicated in the survey results that Elsevier was a serious candidate for cancellation this year. There were actually less than 5, I believe. And also the simple fact that we've got really no viable options on the table from Elsevier whatsoever. So as a result of those two things, the board decided in September that really they wanted us, the negotiation team, the CSC and staff, to focus on getting the best price we possibly could for the contract, and looking forward to building a consensus among members over these next few years, but having a nationwide response to what Sue was speaking to, but how we're going to deal with Elsevier moving forward. So the results for the Elsevier Science Direct deal going forward for the next 3 years, 2% increase for next year, followed by 2.5% after that, and 2.75% for the final year. So these are actually, I mean, these are pretty good. We're pretty proud of these numbers. These are the lowest we've had with Elsevier since the outset of the contract, which was 12 years ago, which historically they've been around the 4% range. The last contract we got them down to 3.5, 3.7, 3.9, and now we're down to up to 2.75. This is pretty much in keeping with what other consortia have been able to achieve internationally. So having discussions with European colleagues at ICAAL, they're about in the 2 to 3% range as well with Elsevier for the most part. For the larger consortia, the JISC and the Dutch and others. Some of the historical stuff that you may or may not be interested in that are benefits to our license is that there's no content fee. That's going to continue. There's no minimum to be a participant in the Freedom Collection. That will continue. As is typical with Elsevier, they're requiring, quote unquote, 100% participation of all the members that are currently in the contract in order to satisfy these terms and to achieve these pricing terms. But as we know in the past, we've had institutions cancel, and this hasn't been an issue. As long as we don't see a vast exodus of members off the license, I don't suspect that a few cancellations will affect this offer. And we'll work with them on a case-by-case basis to make sure that that doesn't happen. There will be a swapping allowance, however minute it is. So you'll be able to swap as many titles as you want off of your core collection, as long as you don't reduce the actual value of those titles more than 0.4%. So you'll be able to do that in years 2 and 3. And opt-out will be to be determined. So that, as I mentioned, we're still negotiating the actual license language in the contract itself. So I suspect that to be a bit of a fight, but we'll see how that proceeds in the next few weeks. I think that brings me to the end. So I'm happy to answer questions about this or something that I didn't cover that you didn't cover. So yes, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Craig. Questions for Craig?
So does the OA focus in Europe have something to do with the APCs are funded by the European Union type thing?
Well, in some cases they're funded, I think, centrally by either consortia or by a funding agency like RLUK, for example, in Britain. I think that's a big part of it. But there's also, I think, a bit of there's certainly not a consensus across all of Europe to say that gold open access is the way to proceed. And a lot of those Southern European library consortia, for example, are really focused on green open access. So for them, the flipping model, their argument against that is, well, why are we going to continue to give all the publishers all this money for APCs? You're still paying the same amount of money, you're not saving, you're not making any reductions. So I don't think there's a consensus there either about which way to proceed. In my experience, from what I heard conversationally.
And Smith Acadia, it's also heavily required. At least in the UK, it's not an option. So any funding, research funding, it is a requirement. There is no... And research is assessed. There's a national research assessment exercise every X years. It's a heavily managerialist culture. So there isn't quite the same... The days of the discussion of you can't make me do this are long gone. It's how are you doing this? So it is a very... we're not really comparing apples with apples, and I'm not advocating for that approach. I'm just saying it's quite different.
Yeah, we have the tri-agency policy here, which also has requirements for research-funded research. But I think it's less strenuous maybe than in the UK. I think it's fair to say. But there's options within that policy after green or gold, so it doesn't specifically say gold or green, so there's that.
I'm interested in the plans for the TDR and what's CRKN's TDR in association with maybe Canadiana's TDR, Scholars Portal TDR, and those of us who might be subscribers to Portico. And are the suggested services going to be similar to what Portico has, so we could exit out of Portico and pay someone in Canada, or what?
Well, first of all, the first part of your question about Canada, the news hot off the press is that the members voted in favor of that, of the merger or combination, whatever you want to call it. So assuming that goes forward, there could be, we would obviously have access, and CRKN's, the Canadian Annex TDR would become CRKN's TDR essentially. But the main difference there is that that particular TDR is very much focused on a whole other different kind of content. So it's primary source material, newspapers, that type of thing. So we're looking at it very much as a complementary thing. So they're not really competing for services they would provide. So there's that, first of all. In terms of comparing it to Portico, I think it would be very similar to what Portico offers, but I think it would be better service. I think it's fair to say, simply because it's, first of all, homegrown in Canada, so the content would all be posted here. I'm not super familiar with how Portico's workflow process works when there's a trigger event, but from what I've gleaned from having conversations with members on the TDR subgroup or the TDR task group, is that oftentimes when a journal ceases publication and you want to have access through Portico, there's a number of layers of discussion and negotiation you have to go through with Portico personnel and also with, I think, the publisher as well. So I think there'd be a bit more work with on the Portico side of things than there would be in a potential solid Scholars Portal CRKN partnership. Whereas with that, you could just say, as soon as the publisher or as soon as the publication starts publishing, it's already hosted in Scholars Portal. We've already prearranged and negotiated for access to it in a post-termination scenario. It's in the license. So as soon as you decide to cancel the license, you can simply redirect your users from the publisher platform over to the Scholars Portal platform, and access is hopefully seamless. So that's the vision for it. Anyway.
Will the cost be? Yeah, so it's always about cost and, what can we afford and what's practical?
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to delve at, certainly because from a lack of knowledge point of view, certainly because we haven't really gone that far into the discussion about that at this point, and also from the point of view of not wanting to step on any toes in terms of the task group focus and so on and so forth. But I feel comfortable saying that having looked at on a preliminary basis at what it costs to run Scholars Portal on an annual basis, and having mapped that out outside of Ontario, I don't think the costs would be too outrageous, but again, it's going to be a relative and perspective thing. So what might be outrageous to one institution might be different from another. So we looked at modeling it across the CRKN bands at an in-person meeting. So maybe 13 different, so I guess price points depending on the size of your institution and so forth. But again, it's early days and we're only looking at this sort of an exploratory point, and we'll only be sort of recommendations to the CRKN board in their final report. So there's nothing sort of set in stone at this point. I'm shy. Don't go easy on me.
Any other questions for Craig?
That you expected me to discuss today, so I really want to make sure that address what it was you thought you were going to hear from CRKN today. So.
Great. Okay. Oh.
I know you're all excited now.
Sue Cleyle from Memorial. Craig, what do you think the national response to Elsevier is going to look like after the license is done? You made reference to it, we've talked around it, but we haven't really sat down and started to. Well, great question. You tell me. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'll answer from a personal perspective. I mean, not speaking for CRKN, I think it's probably the safest thing to do. I would love to see libraries take a firm stance against it and get administration on the side and draw a line in the sand and say, these are objectives and we're not going to renew the license unless they're met. So similar to what they've been doing in Germany, similar to what they've been doing in the Netherlands. But in order to do that, you have to get that administration buy-in and that, and faculty buy-in we dipped our toes into how to achieve that with the institutional mobilization task group who Stephanie mentioned earlier. So we have some communication tools to start to begin that conversation with senior administration. But I think to advance that further, we have to figure out how you do that on a national basis and start to get that conversation going. Because that's the only thing I think is going to give us success, because CRKN can only have so much leverage when each year we go to Elsevier and say, oh, we need to reduce costs and so on and so forth, but then when it comes times to renew, we have a couple of cancellations, but overall, 90% or more of the institutions decide to renew the contracts. So we have to find some way to give us as a consortium and as a country more leverage. I think it's the only way to success. I wish I had a better answer how to achieve that, but I mean that's what I'd like to see.
Thanks, Craig. It's Leslie from UNB, and I think if we are to have any conversations with our administration and faculty about Elsevier, the better informed we can be across the country as to how Elsevier is being responded to, as you've just shared with us in Germany and so on, will be helpful, because we'll get asked questions about that, because people sort of have a sense that something's happening, but they don't know much about it. And our faculty love to publish in Elsevier, as well as enjoying access to the journals. There's a lot of publishing and editing and so on that go on in Elsevier journals, just because they are so often the key journals in people's subject areas. So if it's you or the content strategy committee or the board or whoever it should be, to help provide that background to Elsevier, I think if there is to be any momentum gathered to stand firm against it, the better informed we can be about how Elsevier renewals and licensing is going on elsewhere, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the main difficulties you highlighted, is that Elsevier, they know that their content is the most valued probably of all the major publishers. They know that faculty love to have access to their stuff and love to publish other stuff, so that makes the negotiations all that much more difficult than it does with someone like Taylor and Francis, where you can show that only 10% of their content in some institutions is actually valued by their faculty and their students. But also, I think what's difficult in getting to your point specifically, knowing more about the global trends, is that yes, the Dutch and the Germans are taking a hard stance against Elsevier, but it's for entirely different reasons than we would like to take a hard stance against them, somewhat, because they're not trying to reduce the cost of their subscription, they're trying to convert a lot of entirely to one of golden access. So it'll be important to, I think, know the context, but also explain why they're doing things differently.
And that's exactly the kind of information that I think. Thanks. I think that's exactly the kind of nuance that we're going to need to understand, because it certainly there'd be nothing easy for us about launching a conversation that is about how do we live without Elsevier. I mean, the financial piece obviously speaks to people, but we would need to understand those nuances and the difference between the extent to which they do speak with a national voice. Yeah, but I'm certainly not advocating for Elsevier. Don't get me wrong. I'm just wanting to be. To give it the best shot we possibly can, if we do want to stand up against the license, is it?
I think maybe something that would be useful, and I'm just spitballing here. Claire may kill me when an interesting. You're recorded. An interesting keynote for the AGM next year, or our future AGM, would maybe be inviting someone from the Dutch negotiating team to come and say, explain how they got their administration involved in the negotiations.
Yeah, that would be really good.
It's Mark from Mount Allison again. I think, unless I missed it, you also missed one other European country that has been doing a German-style thing, and that's Finland.
Right. Yes.
Right. The other thing I just wanted to say is that it seems to me we're in a bit of a, I don't know if it's a catch-22 or a game of chicken, but that it's very hard for us as individual university librarians to light that spark on our own campuses absent a larger fire at, for example, a CRKN or a CAAL-CBPA level, something that we can say, see, our colleagues are doing this, and yet those organizations aren't going to do anything until there's a critical mass of fires at the individual institutional level. And I don't know how we break that, and how we get to the point where we say, you know what, I've had enough and I'm not going to take it anymore, and somebody actually does it.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. So we're right on time. We have 10 minutes for wrap up. So if there are any additional comments or topics you want to bring up. The other thing I would say is I want to thank everyone for participating, particularly probably the patience and the in and out and all that sort of stuff of the online. So glad you guys stuck with us, whoever stuck with us. Also, I just wanted to put in a little plug for Tanya and I guess for me a bit for people who are not on the board, but Tanya hears the conversations at the board level, so she can definitely bring that from the CAAL perspective to the CSC. But as well, anyone can come, any of the CAAL members, any of the staff, librarians, can come to Tanya or I with feedback, with ideas, because we talk about all kinds of things at the CRKN level, and it really is a focus to make things better for the membership. So any ideas, feel free to send us an email, and we'll bring those concerns on CAAL's behalf to the CSC.
Slides and all the recordings and everything will be put up on the CAAL website, and I'll send it the link to everybody. So I just have to see what we got on recording from different places, whether I have to do any editing.
Are we doing some sort of evaluation?
Yeah, I will send out an evaluation because I know who all came. So I have a list of the names. I can send those out. Okay.
You're free to go.